Great. So, welcome to Imagining the Environment lecture series. This series was started on 23rd of August and would run up to until the end of October, where we would have a book discussion, which is by Camelia Divan. So far, we've had 4 lectures. One was due last week, which was cancelled. Last week, which was cancelled, and we're trying to find a date to have her speak. So very sorry for that. But the lecture series is part of a larger conceptualization of environmental history and politics that has gone into the project that I'm working on. I am Rahul Ranjan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Oslo Metropolitan University. And I work for a project called Riverine Rights that looks at the idea of environmental personhood and juristic personhood in context of Colombia, India, and New Zealand. And within the project, I have a proposal that looks at the idea of grief, emotion, collective memory, trauma, and rights of river. Before I introduce Kavita today, there are 2 ways in which you can ask the question. One is to write your question down into the chat box, and I will have it read. And since Kavita is the co-host, she'll also have the access to it. But for the sake of others, I will have the question read at the end of the talk. And other way to ask question is to use the reaction and use the emoji to raise your hand, and I can have you unmuted and you can ask your question yourself. So we are very happy to have Kavita here. For a part of brief introduction, Kavita is a journalist and a researcher who writes at the intersection of politics and environment in the Indian Himalayan region. Having worked with 2 most esteemed newspaper in the past, The Hindu and the Indian Express, she currently works independently. As a resident of Himalaya as herself, Kavita is passionate about her region's story, especially one that revolves around the water. She is an electronic engineer turned storyteller who is also a graduate in water science policy management from University of Oxford. And for our own project here at Oslo, but I'm certain that for many scholars around the world who works in spaces of fragile ecology and Himalaya, they look up to your stunning work. Among others, she's recently published this really thorough work, which is co-authored by over 50 people comprising of academics, scientists, civil society member, Kavita herself, that looks at the Chamoli incident, which happened on 7th of February this year. So anybody looking out to read from Kavita's work, it's a great place to learn from. Kavita, welcome to the lecture series. You have about 40 to 50 minutes to talk, and then at the end we'll have the question. What I would do is turn off my video, but you can share the screen, and I'm here for any question that you would like to ask. So yeah, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rahul. So I'm audible and loud enough, right?
Yes, perfect.
So I'll just share my screen. 1 second. Does it show anything? Does it show my screen? No?
No, not yet.
1 second. 1 second. Why? Okay.
Yeah.
Does it show now?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Perfect.
So this is the topic, which is pretty big. We are problematizing environment versus development narratives in the Himalaya, and I'm looking at the case of Uttarakhand, which is where I'm a resident of Uttarakhand as well. Rahul has already introduced me. I used to be an electronics engineer, and then I became a journalist, and then I also now am into research. So I am concerned about my region as a Himalayan resident, and also because I work here. Everything around my life is around the Himalaya and Uttarakhand. So most of my work has been here. While working as a journalist, I've reported on the environment, politics, education, crime, everything of areas like Himachal, Uttarakhand, Rajasthan, UP. So I have like a diverse understanding of a lot of things. If anybody is not able to hear what I say or there's a lack of clarity, please type in the text. So Rahul, please let me know.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, so I begin my presentation. It's into two parts, basically. At first, I want to talk about some themes that journalism has helped me uncover or understand in the Himalayas, especially Uttarakhand, regarding environment and development. So basically, the first half of this presentation will be about understanding what are these environment versus development narratives. And the second half then goes on to the problematizing part, wherein I look at when we talk of environment and development, is it that easy a binary? Or if not, what are the complexities? So we'll look at that in the second part. So I start with the first part. So Uttarakhand, we can see the map here. The red part is Uttarakhand, and Uttarakhand is into two parts. It's Garhwal and Kumaon, both are called Garhwal Himalaya, Kumaon Himalaya. It's part of the Indian Himalayan region. The state has a population of 10 to 11 million, and the area is around 53,000 square kilometers, which is bigger than Bhutan, but like 1/3 of Nepal. There are over 900 glaciers. The river Ganges or the Ganga originates in Uttarakhand. All its head streams originate in Uttarakhand. They combine together in a place called Devprayag. There is where Ganga comes, the Ganga. So yeah, when we talk of Uttarakhand, we are mainly talking of the environment because its main when we talk of the Himalaya, we talk of how picturesque it is and how fragile. So environment is important in Uttarakhand that way. Our lives depend on it. We can die literally of the disasters that happen. So yeah, and Uttarakhand shares international boundaries with Nepal and Tibet. That's where it's situated geographically. So moving on, looking at the environmental concerns in this presentation. So when we talk of the environment in Uttarakhand, we talk of receding glaciers, landslides, floods, extreme weather events like extreme rainfall and earthquakes. These are the major things that we talk about. And floods could be because of multiple things, extreme weather or a glacial lake outburst flood when a glacier breaks. So when a glacier breach happens. So these are the things, these are the environmental concerns in the state. The photograph you see is of Kedarnath, 2013. A glacial lake outburst flood had happened and over 4,000 people had died. That's the official figure. Unofficially, it was more than 20,000. That was my first assignment as a journalist, covering the Kedarnath disaster. And that's when it started, my understanding of what it really means when we talk of environment and people and economy, everything, and marginalization in Uttarakhand. That's where it began, and it has continued the journey. So the first part of the presentation, we look at 3 different kinds of projects that the government currently is engaged in. We look at beautification projects, then road construction projects and hydropower projects. I'll just give a brief overview of what these are. If anybody wants more details about any of this, I am very happy to engage beyond this presentation also. You can write to me on Twitter or you can ask Rahul for my email ID. Absolutely happy to engage or help or discuss or learn on these things. So starting with beautification projects that our government is engaged in. This place is called Sukhatal. This is in Nainital. I'm a resident of Nainital. It's a hill station in Uttarakhand. And this place is 800 meters from my town, which is basically a part of my town. They're making it into a beautification project wherein they'll make a pool here. They'll concretize the base of this pool. They'll do some boating here. They'll construct shops here because they want an additional spot in the town for touristic purposes. Now, the problem here is that you see in the next picture, that's Nainital. This is 2017, and you see how dry the lake is on all sides. that shouldn't happen. That's like red flag all over. That's alarm bells ringing, because we're dependent on this water for our daily needs. It's also the aesthetic center of our town, the lake. And when it's drying up, we don't know what will be of our town without this lake. And why is Sukhatal related to the lake? Because Sukhatal, where the project is to be constructed, is one of the main recharge zones for Nainital. So if you concretize the base of the Sukhatal lake bed, then there's no recharge that will happen from there. So about 50% of subsurface recharge for the Naini lake happens from Sukhatal. But the authorities are ready to concretize it. So that's the kind of project we're talking about when we're talking about environment versus development. So, and this is another project. You see a lake. This is just a Google Maps image. And the red part that I've circled is the area where a project is to come up. This place is called Sattal. It's around 23 kilometers from Nainital. It's India's topmost, it's amongst top five bird watching sites in the country. And we are constructing beautification projects here as well. We want to beautify this place. I don't know what that means. So here you see the work has begun already. And Sattal, this town is Sattal. Sattal is, it's got more than 300 bird species, more than 500 butterfly species. Its biodiversity value is huge, humongous. Without any studies, the government is ready to just concretize it and make concrete structures here. So this project is also facing opposition. These are examples of how our government is looking at environment and development. So elections are coming up. And now they want these projects to be completed as soon as possible for electoral benefit as well. Then we come at road construction. I'll very briefly touch upon this. This is also a very big issue in Uttarakhand because the way roads are constructed in Uttarakhand is very unscientific. So there's this project, a particular project I'll talk about is the Char Dham Roads project. It's around 825 kilometers of road to be constructed in Uttarakhand, and over 500 kilometers is completed already. This was announced in 2016. And over the past years, over 200 people have died in various landslide instances in this project. So the government is in denial. They want broader roads. And the way they even cut mountains for the roads is very unscientific. So this year alone, over 1,100 instances of landslides have happened across Uttarakhand, and over 25 of them have been on this Char Dham road project route. So one can imagine that there is obviously an environment versus development debate ongoing. One can't deny that. So yeah, this is the second thing. And then I move on to hydropower projects, which is my main area of work. So when we talk of hydropower projects, we basically talk of compensation, rehabilitation issues, that people don't get the money for their land, or when tunnels are dug within mountains, the land above them sinks. So if there are villages above these mountains, the houses will sink. There'll be cracks appearing in the houses. So there's more, the proneness to landslides increases when you dig tunnels in mountains, and explosives are used for tunneling, which is even more detrimental. So there'll be even more landslides then. So this has been noticed as well, that the landslides have increased in areas where hydropower projects have come up. So the other thing is about muck dumping. So the muck that is excavated for these projects should ideally be taken away into trucks to some other ground and dumped there. But what happens is that the muck is dumped within the river, because the idea is that with the river flow, the muck will also flow away and the project companies will save money, basically. Then there's compensatory afforestation. You have to grow trees elsewhere if you cut them for any project, but that doesn't happen. And then the electricity that is produced out of these projects is not for locals. It's sold elsewhere. So that way there are so many concerns. So in Uttarakhand, the 2013 data says that over 450 projects had been proposed or commissioned or under construction or completed, and they were to produce about 27,000 megawatts. But Then the 2013 disaster happened, the Kedarnath disaster, and the Supreme Court said that there's been a lot of questioning on hydropower construction. So there should be a committee to look into whether hydropower projects is exacerbated the 2013 disaster, right? So a committee was appointed. It was called the Chopra Committee. In 2014, the committee submitted its report and said clearly that yes, hydropower projects did exacerbate the disaster. So after that, the case is ongoing in the Supreme Court. So a number of projects, construction on a number of projects is not ongoing right now, but that doesn't mean the government is backing. They're pushing for hydropower projects. A recent example is the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. They submitted an affidavit in this Supreme Court case saying that there are these 7 projects which are over 50% complete. So please give a go ahead to them, because otherwise it'll be a waste of money. So clearly, and they had the support of the Uttarakhand government also. So clearly there's a push for hydropower, despite the fact that hydropower is extremely detrimental in several ways for Uttarakhand. So this is from 2013, and this is not just Kedarnath was devastated in 2013. A lot of the state was. This is in Srinagar town. You can see the amount of muck there was, and this muck is actually from Srinagar Dam. So when floods happened, a lot of muck came along the Alaknanda River. This muck was dumped into the river by authorities, people constructing the Srinagar Dam, and that muck came along and inundated or just covered the town when floods happened. So a lot of people, there was a lot of loss of property in that way. A lot of property was damaged. So then this is again 2013 floods. This is the Vishnuprayag Dam, which is near Badrinath. So this was actually completely damaged in 2013 because this is near paraglacial zones. It's a highly unstable zone. The boulders, highly unstable area to construct a dam in. And when the floods happened, obviously the boulders came in, there was water, the dam gates were choked, dam was completely, it was damaged. And then without any assessment questioning from the government or the Ministry of Environment, the dam construction started just after the disaster, and then they reconstructed the entire dam. So there was no question even then even after such a big disaster, nobody questioned the viability, nobody in the government or in power questioned the viability of such huge structures in a fragile area like Uttarakhand. So you see, this is just downstream of the Vishnuprayag Dam. This is the Alaknanda River. Nobody would believe there is no river here. It's just boulders. You see a little amount of water. That's the only amount of water there is. So what has happened is that most of this water has been tunneled into the mountain to produce hydropower. So then there is no water in the main river. So this is the situation in Uttarakhand. This is in the vicinity of Tehri Dam. So Tehri Dam is a 1,000 megawatt dam in Uttarakhand. There was a huge outrage against it when it first came up. So it's known to many, the Tehri Dam resistance. And so you see this house, there's landslide near it. And there are also cracks in this house because the land beneath this house is sinking because there's erosion in the dam, and the land underneath this house or many houses is just sinking. So the houses are developing cracks and there are landslides all over. So these are the things that dam companies don't talk about. And these are the things that people don't anticipate before projects are constructed, but these are a reality as we see in Uttarakhand. So yeah, these need to be looked at. Now, this has been discussed a lot in this series, but I'll touch upon it again because I've worked closely on this also. So this is February 7, 2021 this year, and there was this huge ice and rock and ice avalanche that happened, and 2 hydropower projects were damaged. Over 200 people died. Of these over 200 people, 190 were actually at the project sites, at the hydropower project sites. So one can't deny that there was a role that hydropower projects were playing in this, because there was no early warning system that would even tell these workers that there is a flood coming. So all these were workers in these two hydropower projects. The first project that was damaged by the February flood was Rishi Ganga hydropower project. You can see what has happened. It's just washed away. And this was not the first time that it was damaged. This was also damaged in 2013 floods and 2016. Then we come to Tapovan Vishnugad hydropower project. You can see a skeleton in the picture where the light is. That's all that remains of the project. It was almost 75% complete by the time the disaster happened. And because of the disaster now, they are under 1,500 crore. Like they lost that much money on this project. So this is what happens. And I think over 138 people died in this project. So this is the reality. So when we're working on this paper that Rahul introduced in the beginning, that we wrote a paper for Science on this disaster. What happens generally is in a lot of science journals, when disasters are discussed, they just touch upon the environmental hazard aspect. So they'll say, most of the papers will say that a flood happened and these are the technicalities. This is the time at which it happened. This is the speed. This is what really unfolded. Nobody really talks about, not nobody, but a lot of researchers, especially in India, because they are also funded by the government, don't really talk about the impacts of this natural or environmental or unnatural hazard. So we made it a point that we will talk about the disaster aspect, and we will talk about the deaths, and we will talk about hydropower. And that's why I was very satisfied with that science paper, because it is being used in many litigations in the Supreme Court and Uttarakhand High Court, which talk about which question hydropower generation and hydropower construction in Uttarakhand. And so yeah, at least a knowledge is being put to some use that way. So yeah, so this is how I get to the environment and development narratives. This is how I find out through journalism what is happening, what are the themes emerging. So journalism is kind of not very in-depth, if we can talk about it, unless you follow it up for years and years. It's good for finding themes. So you kind of find out, okay, this is what is happening. These are the overlying or overarching themes. So yeah, I understand clearly that there's a clear narrative of environment versus development in Uttarakhand. But when we talk of environment versus development narrative, so because I've been working in Uttarakhand for a number of years, I would feel like everywhere I would go, like every anti-dam protest I would go to, or every anti-dam protest I would find out about, I would be talking to the same people. It would be either this political group or that NGO, and the same people were everywhere. So I always wanted to know, what are the locals thinking? What is their reaction? So the locals would always be in the background. They always would be carrying posters. So I never would get to speak to them or find out their inputs on why they are protesting. It was as if somebody is always leading them. So I have been personally very interested in anti-dam movements, just to find out about what are they about, who are the leaders, why aren't the locals the leaders, aren't the locals the leaders, like all those questions. So this is where we get to the problematizing part, because when we talk about environment, this is the part 2. When we talk of environment and development, it's kind of this clear-cut binary, right? It's as if this is all that is, like nothing else. There is environment and there's development. Either you are this side or that side. But then when you go into it, deeper into it, all people who are on the environment side are not saying the same things. They're not on the same page. Probably all people on the development side are not on the same page. So there are complexities to unravel, to disentangle, to understand, to uncover. So that's the second part. So let me start this. So we will look at the Pancheshwar anti-dam movement when we talk about this second part. So Pancheshwar is a place in Uttarakhand. It is near Uttarakhand-Nepal border. So I want to this is an ongoing project that I'm working on, and I'm looking at the leadership in Pancheshwar anti-dam movement, exactly to find out what are the complexities in the leadership, where are the locals, what is the role of the marginalized in anti-dam movements, who are the marginalized, all those things. So we've like reached almost the conclusion of this, but yeah, I'm just sharing what we found. It's not published yet, so can't be used officially, but yeah, I'm just sharing what we found. So you see in the map, the red line, that's where the Mahakali River is. That's where the Pancheshwar Dam is to be constructed. Pancheshwar Dam is going to be the biggest in Uttarakhand, biggest probably in the Himalayan areas here on the Indian side, because it's 5,040 megawatts. It's humongous. So it's also controversial. This goes back to 1996 when the Mahakali Treaty was signed between Nepal and India, and then there was Maoist uprising in Nepal, so nothing happened on the project. And then again, the Modi government came in, and then Modi visited Nepal. Prime Minister visited Nepal in 2014, and then signed an MOU saying we'll restart work on this, and this has to happen. Project has to come up between India and Nepal. So the Mahakali River is between India and Nepal, and the project is into two parts. You can see in the map, I don't know, the blue bubbles. The bigger one is called Pancheshwar, it's 4,800 megawatts. The smaller one is called Rupali Garh, 240 megawatts. And over 82,000 people will be displaced or impacted in some way because of this project. So overall, 5,040 megawatts will be constructed on the Indian side, on the river Mahakali. So looking at environmental social movements, obviously, the theory says that it's a Western concept from the 1960s. Environmentalists also have been defined very clearly. Academics say they're urban, middle class, educated, led by the green agenda. That's there in theory. And when we talk of social movements or environmental social movements, there are different views in academia. There is one view which says that environmental social movements or social movements in general are homogeneous, like everybody's talking about the same thing. It's single agenda. Everybody has a unified set of demands. That's the ideal way it is looked at by a set of academics. Another set of academics who would say, no, but it's structurally complex. Social movements involve a lot of individuals or groups or organizations that they could have different agendas. And some people in this could be more powerful than the others. So there are differing views on what it is that makes up a social movement, right? So I was also interested in looking at that aspect through this project. So we come to social movements and political ecology. Very interestingly, political ecology firstly doesn't look at social movements enough. Secondly, when it does, it has very different views. There's one view which says that by somebody like Robbins or Escobar, they'll say that, oh, social movements empower the marginalized. So they have this optimistic view towards social movements. And then there's this other view, which is this contrasting view, which says by somebody like Fawcett, they'll say that, or Peat and Watts, they'll say that social movements might actually further marginalize the marginalized population. So this also I really wanted to find out through this project as to what is really happening. Are the marginalized being empowered, or are they being further marginalized or not? What is happening, right? So the framework I used political geography, because this is a transboundary hydro project. Then I used theory of marginalization and intersectionality to actually find out who are the marginalized in this, just to spot them. And then using social movement theory to identify social movements in India and Nepal. But there wasn't much happening in Nepal. Most of it was in India. I was looking at between the period of 2014 and 2019. And then I use political ecology to find out how the marginalized are being impacted by this social movement, right? So the findings were that the representing, so I was looking at two groups, basically one group started in 2014, and it was basically led by the Congress. There was one leader that was looking at the other groups. So these are groups which are opposing some aspect of the Pancheshwar Dam. I'm looking at the Indian side because Nepal side does not have as much anti-dam protest. This first group was led by a Congress leader, a local Congress leader in Pithoragarh, and their demand was for proper compensation and rehabilitation, right? And then the second group was found in 2016. They had around 5 leaders, and this was more democratic in the sense it had different people, different agendas. It was NGOs, it was some local shopkeeper, different kinds of people coming together in this group. But their objective was to totally oppose the dam. So what happened was that this was ongoing. Their opposition to the dam was ongoing, and then suddenly in 2017, the public hearings were scheduled for the Pancheshwar Dam on the Indian side. So what happened was that the public hearings didn't happen properly. The people who had objections, they were not allowed to raise those objections. So then the protests actually gathered a lot of pace, and people started coming to the streets, sloganeering, burning effigies, saying that we don't want this dam. Also, it is to be noted the fact that on this Mahakali River had also suffered a lot of damage in 2013 floods, because it was not just Kedarnath. A number of rivers in the state were impacted in 2013. So on the Nepal side, especially, there was a lot of impact. People had to be moved. They had to be shifted out from their houses. There was floods. This region where the mist to come up is also very fragile. There are landslides every year. People die in accidents during monsoon season. So the locals who were on the streets didn't really support the project, but they weren't heard properly in the public hearing. So then they went out against the project, saying we don't want this. So this happened in 2017. The protests gathered pace, and then it continued in 2018. But by 2019, there was no protest. So I was very keen to know what really happened. So the Congress leader said that their main agenda was rehabilitation and compensation. They said that, there were differences between India and Nepal side cropping up. So the project kind of got halted. So they said, oh, we'll protest when we have to. Right now, the project isn't happening. This is what the Congress group said. The other group, which had these NGOs and everybody, the locals, as part of it, they had a different story because they had 5 leaders. So because I'm also looking at where are the marginalized in this anti-dam movement, I found that only 1 out of these 5 were marginalized in the sense of caste. There was one man who was a lower caste amongst these 5 leaders, but he was not marginalized in the sense that he was a shopkeeper. He was the ex-pradhan, the village head. So he was pretty much a part of the mainstream in that way. But he was the only local also in this second group. Everybody else was an outsider, if we can use the term. So there were people from different states, from Delhi, maybe Himachal, who were coming in to protest, NGOs. And so what happened is that slowly they started leaving. So by 2019, only this single local low caste man, ex-pradhan, was the one remaining protesting the dam. Everybody else had left. And then when I found out why, it was because there was some local politics, so some had to leave. Some others left because the projects that were funding them, these NGOs, were on different things. For example, there was one leader who was being funded for Forest Rights Act. This anti-dam movement did not involve any FRA related things. They didn't have funding, so they left. So basically, then I spoke to this person, the local, who was the only remaining leader. He said, I can't do it alone. I can't be carrying out this entire protest alone. So clearly, there was the protest suffered. So the locals who had joined, and even if they were in the background with banners, they suffered, right? So overall, what I found in this was that there was extremely low representation of marginalized. And by marginalized, I mean women, I mean the poor, I mean low caste, I mean people who live in really far off areas who don't have access to good schools, healthcare, roads, anything. They are the people who are losing land in this project, right? So they suffered because a lot of people left. So then what happens is, theory also says that when we talk of environmentalism, when we talk of urban people coming in and telling others, the locals, about what is to be done, what is the right thing to do, what is to be protested, they look at the green agenda, they look at the environmental concerns. But in reality, the locals can have other concerns, which could be non-green, which could be labor related, it's called red, right? So non-green or red concern. So what happens is that there is low representation of the locals in leadership or in decision-making areas or in agenda-setting meetings. When there is low representation, their agenda is not put forth properly. So a woman would have some problem with, she's the one in Uttarakhand working on the land. She's going to lose that land, but there is no representation of the woman in the meeting. So there will be no concept of that when demands are set out by the social movement leaders, because they don't know, right? So that's how, that's why I think it matters that the marginalized are represented very well in a social movement. And it's important to think of who leads social movements. And that's where I think we talk of problematizing environment and development, because everything environment is not non-complex. It is complex. And it has to be understood and it has to be addressed. So when I spoke to one of the leaders of these movements and I said, so why don't you engage with the marginalized? They said, oh, but like we have limited time when we have to organize protests. So what we do is we just talk to our concerned, already set networks. We just talk to them so they can just gather people. So that's why we can't reach out to more people. So basically who's left out by these in these negotiations or in these already pre-existing networks are left out, and that are mostly the marginalized, and it could be marginalized in any way, economically, socially, any which way, right? So other things that I found is that social movement is transient, which is that there are people coming and going, new people come, some people go. It's not a stable thing. So that's also what complicates it. So I told already that there was no representation of the poor women. There was just one low caste, and they're the people in leadership of this anti-dam movement, and these are the ones who will be most impacted by the project, right? Then of the 6 people who were leading the social movement, only one was low caste Hindu, and everybody else was upper caste, was educated, had a stable job, or was urban. Typically how environmentalists are defined in theory. That's exactly what it was. So, and there was no representation of the marginalized in meetings. Like they had meetings, decision-making meetings and agenda-setting meetings. There was no representation of the marginalized in those meetings. So this is still ongoing, but by what I've understood by now is the fact that if we look at political ecology's 2 perspectives on social movements, as I said earlier, that one says that social movements might, might further marginalize the marginalized, or the second, which says that social movements might emancipate the marginalized. So I feel in this, by what I've deduced, is that it further marginalizes the marginalized, because social movements do that, because the way social movements happen is that there's lack of representation of the marginalized communities in leadership or in agenda setting or decision-making positions. So yeah, this is where I conclude my problematizing the environment versus development narrative. So I feel that as a journalist, when I started off as an engineer, I sat in the classes and we talked about technology, electronics, and we spoke as if it has nothing to do with the world, as if these technologies are in isolation. And then I wanted to know what it is, like where are these technologies working? What is happening? Who are the people who are impacted? Also, I was very keen on understanding my own geography and my own people. So I wanted to do journalism so that I understand my own region properly. So that's why I switched to journalism to understand the narratives on ground, what's happening really. Because when we sit in engineering classes, we don't know what's happening on the ground, right? So that helped me. Journalism helped me understand these themes. And then now, as I slowly also want to branch out, and I'm branching out to research, I understand how complex these themes can be and why it is important to understand these complexities. So yeah, I just wanted to use this time to just kind of throw different topics to you so you can kind of think about it. We can discuss them again. So I think, yeah, that's my side.